In a bustling mansion on the edge of the city, wealth and power seemed to flow endlessly. Mr. Thomas, a successful and wealthy businessman, lived there with little regard for the lives of those around him. One day, as he lounged in his lavish living room, he noticed Clara, the housemaid, struggling to clean the floors. Clara, a hard-working single mother, quietly endured the weight of her responsibilities while carrying herself with dignity. Amused by her efforts, Thomas smirked and made an offhand, dismissive comment. His words cut through the air like a sharp blade, but Clara didn't flinch. Instead, she continued her work with silent resilience. What Thomas didn't realize was that this brief, cruel moment would set off a chain of events that would change his life forever. Sometimes, life has a way of teaching lessons in the most unexpected ways. What happens next will leave you inspired. Thomas leaned back in his expensive leather chair, chuckling softly as he watched Clara scrub the floor. To him, she was just another nameless worker, someone invisible in his world of privilege. He didn't notice the exhaustion in her eyes or the strain in her movements. Clara, however, was no stranger to people like Thomas. She'd worked for years in households like his, cleaning up after others while trying to provide for her young son, Ethan. Unknown to Thomas, Clara's life was far more complex than he could imagine. Every dollar she earned went toward keeping Ethan in school and ensuring he had a better future. That night, as Thomas continued to mock her under his breath, Clara quietly finished her work and walked out, her pride intact. What Thomas didn't realize was that his careless words would come back to haunt him in ways he couldn't foresee. Life has its own way of leveling the playing field. That night, Thomas sat in his grand dining room, surrounded by fine china and crystal glasses, the remnants of his lavish dinner spread before him. He felt a fleeting moment of satisfaction, believing the world revolved around his wealth and success. Meanwhile, Clara walked home through dimly lit streets, her mind weighed down by worry. Her son, Ethan, had fallen ill, and the rising medical bills were more than she could manage. But Clara refused to let her struggles define her. She had always believed that hard work and kindness would somehow lead to better days. The next morning, Clara arrived early, as always, to clean the mansion. As she quietly moved through the rooms, she overheard Thomas on the phone. His booming voice was filled with frustration. An important business deal was slipping through his fingers. For a brief moment, Clara saw a glimpse of vulnerability in the man who had mocked her. But she quickly returned to her work, knowing it wasn't her place to intervene. What neither of them realized was that their worlds were about to collide in an unexpected way, forcing them to confront truths about themselves and each other. The lines between wealth and poverty, power and humility, were about to blur in ways neither could have imagined. Days passed, and Thomas's frustrations only grew. His business deal continued to unravel, threatening his reputation and finances. For the first time in years, he felt something unfamiliar: fear. He began to lash out more, his tone sharper with everyone around him, including Clara. One morning, as she cleaned his office, she accidentally knocked over a small framed photo from his desk. Clara quickly picked it up, but not before noticing the image: a younger Thomas with an older man, likely his father, standing outside a modest shop. She hesitated, sensing there was more to Thomas's story than he let on. Later that evening, Clara returned home to find Ethan's fever worsening. Her heart sank, knowing she couldn't afford the proper care he needed. She debated asking for an advance, but remembered Thomas's biting remarks and cold demeanor. As desperation crept in, she made a decision to confront him the next day, unsure of how he would react. The following morning, as Thomas sat in his study, staring blankly at the papers that marked his failing deal, Clara stood at the door, her hands trembling. She took a deep breath and stepped inside. "Mr. Thomas," she began, her voice steady despite her nerves, "I need to speak with you." Her words startled him, but before he could respond, the doorbell rang. It was a visitor who would change everything, bringing secrets to light and forcing both Thomas and Clara to face the truths they had been avoiding. Thomas frowned as the sound of the doorbell echoed through the house. He stood up abruptly, motioning for Clara to wait. As he opened the door, he was met by an unfamiliar face, a man in his late 30s with a weathered appearance and a stern expression. The man introduced himself as Daniel, a former employee of Thomas's father. Thomas's guarded demeanor shifted to confusion. He hadn't seen or thought about his father's old business in years. Daniel handed him a small envelope, his voice firm but calm. "You should read this. It's about your family's past." Curious and unsettled, Thomas opened the letter while Daniel stood silently waiting. As his eyes scanned the page, the color drained from his face. The letter revealed that his father had once been on the verge of losing everything. But instead of falling into despair, he had been saved by the kindness of an unexpected ally, a maid who had helped him rebuild when no one else would. Clara watched from the doorway, sensing something significant was happening. Thomas looked up, his mind racing, as memories of his father's struggles resurfaced. The timing couldn't have been worse. Just as he was grappling with his own challenges, this revelation about his family's past struck a nerve. For the first time, he felt a pang of shame, wondering if he had misunderstood the people who worked around him all along. Before he could process further, Daniel added one final blow. "The woman who saved your father, her name was Margaret, Clara's grandmother." Thomas turned toward Clara, stunned, as the weight of the truth hit him like a tidal wave. Suddenly, the lines between their lives weren't as separate as he had believed, and the choices he had made now carried a deeper significance than he ever imagined. Thomas stood frozen, the letter trembling in his hands. He glanced at Clara, who looked equally shocked. "Your grandmother," he muttered, his voice trailing off. Clara nodded slowly, her expression a mix of confusion and disbelief. She had grown up hearing stories of her grandmother's kindness and resilience, but had no idea the impact it had made on Thomas's family. Suddenly, Thomas's perspective shifted. He realized how blind he had been to the people who worked tirelessly around him. Clara's quiet strength and unwavering determination reminded him of the stories his father had once shared, stories he had ignored in his pursuit of wealth. Overwhelmed with guilt, he sat down, the weight of his actions pressing down on him. "I didn't know," he whispered. "I didn't realize." But just as the tension seemed to ease, Clara surprised him. "Mr. Thomas," she said firmly, "your apology doesn't pay my bills or heal my son." Her words hit him like a slap of reality. For the first time, Thomas understood that redemption required more than regret. It demanded action. In that moment, Thomas made a decision that would change both their lives. He offered to pay for Ethan's medical expenses and provide Clara with a better salary. But Clara, maintaining her dignity, asked only for what she had earned, fair compensation, and the chance to create a better future for her son. Thomas agreed, but he didn't stop there. He also pledged to start a foundation in honor of Clara's grandmother, one that would help hard-working families like hers rise above their struggles. As Clara left the mansion that evening, she felt a glimmer of hope, not because of Thomas's money, but because of the promise of change. And as Thomas watched her go, he realized that true wealth wasn't measured by money, but by the impact one could make on others. What he thought was the end of his success turned out to be the beginning of his redemption. In the weeks that followed, Thomas began to transform in ways no one had expected. He took a step back from his business to focus on the foundation he promised, naming it Margaret's Hope in honor of Clara's grandmother. Clara continued her work at the mansion, but now, with the dignity and respect she deserved. More importantly, Ethan received the medical care he needed, and Clara could finally breathe a little easier, knowing her son's future was brighter. For Thomas, the change wasn't just in how he treated Clara, but in how he viewed life. He began to value people over profits, learning that true success lies in the connections we build and the kindness we show. As for Clara, her resilience and strength became an inspiration not only to her son but to Thomas as well. In the end, their lives, once so different, became intertwined by a shared story of redemption and hope.